Throughout the early part of the year, GRDC runs a series of advisor update meetings around the country. This year they attracted more people than ever before, and one of the reasons is the calibre of the guest speakers. Groundcover TV went to the Ballarat update for this report.
Talking about the value of the Grains Research and Development Corporation's annual Farm Advisor Updates is a welcome task for Managing Director John Harvey. He's very conscious of the crucial information these forums deliver and wants that news spread.
It's critical that our consultant advisors are up to date with the latest research and development, and it's also critical to GRDC because until a farmer changes, does something different on their farm, plants a different seed or changes the farming practice, then the return on investment on all that R&D we've done is zero.
These pre-season research updates have been running for more than a decade, and the number of advisors attending has been building. At this Victorian update, 260 people listened to some 36 speakers over 2 days.
Welcome to the Ballarat GRDC Advisor Update.
Over 4 weeks, the scene would be repeated at half a dozen locations around the country. Growers themselves set the program's topics in consultation with GRDC's Update Committee. Then the best available speakers are found to address those issues.
I think one of the great strengths of having the updates is that we do have a range of speakers, both local, interstate and international, because when you're getting people from outside your patch, they bring quite a different perspective.
Researcher and academic Linda Hall shared the Canadian experience with weed control in canola, which is that country's second largest crop with 7.4 million hectares grown.
You know, it's important not as a rotational crop, but as the primary money-making crop for the growers.
And how much of that canola is GM?
I'll phrase the question a little bit more differently, because we don't consider GM and canola that was produced through mutagenesis as any different. So we regulate them the same. So we have 3 types of herbicide-tolerant canola. Resistance to glyphosate, glufosinate, which you sell here as Basta, and Clearfield canola, which you also have here.
With those herbicides, what has been the Canadian experience?
Before we had herbicide tolerance, we had very poor weed control, and weed control was the biggest limiting factor in canola production. With the introduction of those herbicides, we had broad spectrum post-emergent weed control that we'd never seen before, and all sorts of consequences came out of that. The most important was we had increase in yield, we had increase in profitability because of that. Less apparent, we actually used less herbicide on a kilogram per hectare basis. The herbicides were more environmentally friendly. We had a reduction in tillage because we didn't need to do tillage for incorporation of pre-emergent herbicides. We reduced our fuel costs.
Linda Hall told her audience the partnership between small university labs and the large corporations was crucial. Between $40 to $80 million is needed to bring a new trait to market, just to get it through the regulatory process. The public sector can't invest that much in a single trait, and so is dependent on the private sector to do so. But can the investment go too far?
Are we getting to a stage though where crops like canola are becoming so successful as plants that they're becoming weeds as well?
You know, that was one of the big concerns that we had before we introduced GM canola. And I have to say that's where I spend most of my research, is determining what crop traits would actually make a plant more aggressive or invasive. We've done an extensive amount of work in Canada looking to see whether canola itself is more persistent or more widespread in the cropping system. Canola is a weed, no doubt about it, but herbicide resistance has not made it more of a weed.
One of the other interesting things that's coming out of Canada is the use that canola can be put to in the future. So maybe you could talk to that point.
We've got a huge effort to improve the quality of our oil for human consumption, but also there's some very interesting research looking at the use of canola oil as a replacement for fish oil in the diets of farm fish. And to do that, we're going to have to up the omega-3 fatty acids, and that will be a GM technology where we actually change the oil profile significantly in canola.
Those attending the Ballarat update also got to hear from another international guest speaker. Orson from the United Kingdom, who runs a subscription farm advisory service, and has a client base that manages 25% of England's farmland.
My background is probably weed science, but inevitably I've been drawn into the issue which I'm talking about at this conference, which is pesticide regulation and how that pesticide regulation is affecting farming now and in the future.
Europe has been regulating pesticide use for decades, and something like 70% of the active chemical constituents in use in the early 1990s are no longer registered. What is of most concern to UK farmers is the European Union's latest strategy for the sustainable use of pesticides.
Well, the new regulations is called the thematic strategy for pesticides, so it doesn't just cover regulation but also use and management of pesticides. But it's a new regulation of pesticides for approval that still is a major issue for us. And that's for the first time in terms of decision making in the regulation process has brought in hazard as well as risk. Now, I think it's a bit technical, but electricity is hazardous, but the risk of using it is low because we know how to manage it. But in European terms and pesticides, hazard is enough to withdraw something. Although in terms of the management it could be risk-free, if it's hazardous, it's being withdrawal.
So what's been the cropping industry, the farmers, what's been their reaction?
Well, that's quite interesting because there are a lot of initiatives that the cropping industry has taken to be more proactive about this, to try and show to the public that we are responsible users of pesticides. And so we've got voluntary introductions of things like sprayer testing, really tightening up on advisor training, continual professional development, and registration of advisors, registration of spray operators, making sure that they also have continual professional development.
There's going to be a greater emphasis, do you think, in future on management practices?
I remember 2 years ago when we usually have the update on blackgrass control, it's all about herbicides, but 2 years ago we spent 3 hours on cultural control. I've never known that happen in a consultant's update before. And we know farmers who have spent £160 per hectare on blackgrass control having to plough up their crops.
Are you aware of any work that's happening in Australia that is useful to the UK? So is it going both ways?
Well, obviously at this conference already I've picked up some wonderful things. I must admit, and I know this is a GRDC DVD, but I was very impressed by the 5-year plan and the planning behind that. And I was sitting there thinking, why can't we be as dynamic as that? And I think it is very important that what we need to do is to make sure that any drift reduction we embrace as an industry, whether in Australia and the UK, can be supported scientifically.
Like Jim Orson, these farm advisors also picked up useful information according to their feedback.
I get very positive feedback. They really like it. We had a chat just before on disc seeders. It's probably something that a lot of advisors don't necessarily get involved in terms of helping growers make decisions on their seeding equipment. But when you can see some dramatic increases in the way that they can handle stubble and still maintain really good yields and getting really good weed control, then sure, they need to know about that stuff too.
Good stuff, important, useful, and most of all, practical stuff.
What I'm looking for here is consultants to walk away with some new ideas, walk away with, and maybe do a bit more research on the web or whatever, but actually go to their growers with some suggestions about how they can make more money out of grain production.
GRDC's Managing Director, John Harvey at Ballarat. If you'd like to watch presentations from the various crop updates, you can always go online at this web address and select from a huge number of choices.